The last time Constable Alfred King was fully healthy, he was standing in snow up to his knees in front of a small log cabin on the Rat River in the far northwestern corner of Canada on the morning of December 31st, 1931. It was close to 40 degrees below zero, the point where the Fahrenheit and Celsius scales meet, cold enough that spit freezes before it lands. Inside the cabin was a man who called himself Albert Johnson, a man who had spoken to almost nobody since arriving in the region 6 months earlier. King had come with a search warrant over a complaint about tampered trap lines, a minor matter, the kind of call that ends with a warning and paperwork. Knocked on the door, identified himself as police, and a rifle bullet came through the wood and hit him in the chest. What followed over the next 7 weeks became, according to Royal Canadian Mounted Police accounts, the largest manhunt in Canadian history to that date. Dozens of men, dog teams, radio dispatches, roughly 20 pounds of dynamite, and for the first time in a Canadian manhunt, an airplane all deployed against a single man on snowshoes, moving through one of the coldest inhabited landscapes on Earth. Here is the part that keeps this case open on the table more than 90 years later. The man they were hunting turned the hunt around. He doubled back along his own trail. He circled behind the men tracking him. Trappers and hunters who had spent their entire lives in that country found his snowshoe prints behind their own positions and understood, in minus 40-degree darkness, that the man they were chasing had been standing there watching them. Before it ended, one young officer would be dead, 2 more men would be shot, and the fugitive would cross a mountain range in a midwinter blizzard by a route local guides considered impossible. When it was finally over, on the ice of a frozen river in the Yukon, the men who turned his body over discovered the strangest fact in the entire file. They had no idea who he was. Nobody did. Nobody does now. The newspapers named him the Mad Trapper of Rat River, and nearly every word of that name would turn out to be wrong. We'll come back to that. Here's what this episode first, exactly what happened at that cabin door on December 31st, and the one detail in Constable King's survival that shaped everything the police did afterward. The 15-hour siege in early January, when 9 armed men and a case of dynamite failed to remove one man from a cabin roughly the size of a garden shed. The crossing of the Richardson Mountains, a climb through a blizzard that the region's most experienced guides had flatly called suicide in winter, and how he did it without lighting a single fire. Fourth, the full inventory of what was found in the dead man's pockets on the Eagle River, a list so strange that researchers are still arguing about single items on it almost a century later. Fifth, the 2007 exhumation of his grave in Aklavik, what modern DNA analysis managed to prove. A larger one note before the restarts, everything in this episode comes from the public record, RCM reports, contemporary newspaper coverage, and the published work of historians and forensic researchers who have spent decades on this case. Where accounts disagree, or where a detail rests on memory rather than documents, I will say so. The man arrived in early July of 1931, floating down the Peel River on a raft toward the settlement of Fort McPherson in the Northwest Territories, just east of the Yukon border. Even the raft is a clue, because a raft only goes down. It meant he had come over the mountains from the Yukon side on foot alone in country where travelers were rare enough that every arrival was an event. Witnesses later described him to police as somewhere in his 30s, around 5'9", perhaps 170 pounds, lean, quiet, with pale blue eyes that more than one person specifically remembered, because he had a way of looking at people without answering them. He gave the name, paid for supplies in cash, and he paid well, peeling bills from a roll at a time when cash of any kind was scarce in the north and most trappers dealt in credit against next season's furs. Bought a 16-gauge shotgun, ammunition, and provisions, and when the local trader tried to make conversation, the man gave answers of 1 or 2 words and left. Where is one documented conversation of any length from this period, and it matters later. A young RCM constable named Edgar Mullen, stationed in the district, heard about the silent stranger and sought him out in Fort McPherson because checking new arrivals was part of the job. Johnson told him almost nothing, no clear account of where he had come from, no destination, but Mullen came away satisfied the man was solvent and self-sufficient, and let him go on his way. Mullen was, as far as the record shows, one of the only people in the entire territory who had stood face-to-face with Johnson and exchanged words with him. Remember that. Johnson declined to buy a trapping license, which cost a few dollars and which every trapper in the region held. Asked about the Rat River country, a hard brushy drainage running up toward the Richardson Mountains, a place even experienced local men considered miserable travel, all willow tangles and overflow ice, and then he went there alone. Through the autumn he built himself a cabin on a promontory at a bend of the Rat, roughly 8 feet by 10, with walls of stacked logs, and, as searchers would later discover, some unusual features under the floor. The site itself was chosen like a defensive position. It sat on raised ground with clear lines of sight along the river approaches, which meant nobody could come at it without being seen. Through the early winter, Gwich'in trappers working lines in that country brought a complaint to the police post at Arctic Red River, the community now known as Sijatkin, they said was springing their traps and hanging them on trees. Suspicion fell on the silent newcomer on the Rat. Historians who have gone back through the record note that the complaint was never actually verified, and some have argued Johnson may not have touched those traps at all, that he was simply the obvious stranger and therefore the obvious suspect. What matters is what the complaint said. On December 26, 1931, the day after Christmas, Constable Alfred King and Special Constable Joe Bernard traveled by dog team to the cabin. was rising from the chimney. King knocked and called out. We could see the man through a small window, and, by King's account, the man looked back at him through the glass and said absolutely nothing, did not gesture, did not shake his head, just watched him. Without a warrant, he could not force entry over an unverified trapline complaint, so he made the long cold run to Aklavik, about 80 miles down the Husky Channel of the Mackenzie Delta, to swear one out before Inspector Alexander Eames, the commanding officer of the Western Arctic Subdistrict. On December 31st, he came back with it, along with 3 other men, King and Bernard, now joined by Constable R. McDowell and Special Constable Lazarus Sittachinley, a Gwich'in constable whose knowledge of that country would matter for the next 7 weeks. Walked to the door, announced himself as police with a warrant, and knocked. A bullet that came through the door struck him on the left side of the chest. Men with him returned fire to cover the recovery, dragged King behind the riverbank, lashed him to a sled, and then ran the dogs 20 hours straight through -40 temperatures back to Aklavik, a run that men who knew the country later called heroic in its own right, because a wounded man strapped immobile on a sled in that cold is fighting hypothermia as much as the bullet. The small mission hospital cart found the bullet had passed clean through King's chest without stopping his heart or his lungs, missing everything vital by fractions of an inch. Constable King lived. And that detail, the fact that this was now attempted murder of a police officer rather than murder, is what shaped the next move. Police still intended to take them out. Inspector Eames assembled a posse, loaded a sled with roughly 20 pounds of dynamite borrowed for the purpose, and went back up the Rat River to arrest one uncooperative trapper. They walked into was something no one in that posse had ever seen. Understand what happened at that cabin on January 9th, you have to stop thinking of it as a cabin and start thinking of it as what the man had actually built, because the two were not the same thing. 9 men arrived that day, Eames commanding, with 42 dogs in the dynamite. The temperature, per the patrol's records, sat near 45 below. Just moving a party that size in those conditions was a feat of logistics, because 42 working sled dogs eat over a pound of fish or meat each per day, and every pound of dog feed, human rations, and equipment had to ride on the sleds, which is arithmetic that will decide this siege before any bullet does. Rounded the cabin and called on Johnson to come out. The answer was rifle fire, and it came from down low at snow level through gaps in the log walls. When the posse finally got close enough to see clearly, they understood why. The man had dug out the floor of the cabin several feet deep, turning the entire structure into a rifle, could stand below ground level, fully protected by frozen earth, and fire through loopholes cut at the base of the walls while the men outside stood silhouetted against the snow. Every advantage of numbers the posse held was cancelled by geometry. At one point, a trapper named Nutlang, a big, experienced man serving as a volunteer, got right up to the cabin and later described glimpsing Johnson down in his pit, moving from loophole to loophole, through dynamite. And here is a detail that tells you what the cold was doing to everyone. Dynamite that has frozen will not detonate reliably, so the men thawed the frozen sticks against their own bodies inside their coats next to their skin, and then hurled them at the walls. Barges blew away parts of the roof and caved in a wall, and each time the smoke cleared, the firing from inside started again, because a man below ground level is protected from blast in almost exactly the way trench warfare had taught a generation of soldiers a decade earlier. Near the end, Eames ordered the largest charge of the night, several pounds thrown together, and it landed close enough to partially wreck the structure. In the ringing silence afterward, 2 men charged the breach, and one of them, a Swedish-born trapper named Carl Gardlund, carried a flashlight, hoping to blind the man inside. Johnson, by the accounts of the men who were there, shot the flashlight out of Gardlund's hand in the dark. Went on for 15 hours through the full darkness of an Arctic January night, and understand what that darkness means at that latitude in January. The sun barely climbs over the horizon at all, so most of this siege was fought by muzzle flash and moonlight on snow. And then the wilderness made the decision for everyone. At those temperatures, a siege consumes food, dog feed, and human endurance at a rate no supply line in that country could sustain. Posse had rations for 2 days. Around 3 in the morning, Eames pulled his men back and returned to Aklavik to regroup and resupply. Read that again from the other side of the ledger. 9 armed men with explosives besieged 1 man in a shed in cold that kills the unprepared in hours, and the 1 man won on point. This is the pattern that repeats through the entire case, and it is the reason this episode is framed the way. Cold, the distance, the darkness, and the terrain punished the pursuers far more than the pursued, because the man they were chasing had somehow made the worst country in North America into his own equipment. When a larger patrol returned to the ruined cabin days later, delayed by a stretch of blizzards, they found the rifle pit, the wrecked walls, and no Albert Johnson. He had walked into the January dark in temperatures that stayed near -4. Vanished. For the next 3 weeks, the hunt spread across the Rat River country, and this is the stretch where the roles genuinely began to reverse. Blizzards erased every trail within hours, which cut against the trackers and served the man alone. The search now involved dozens of men, RCM regulars, Army signalmen, Gwich'in trackers, and trapper volunteers, and it was being followed far beyond the Arctic, because the Royal Canadian Corps of Signals had a wireless station at Aklavik, call sign UZK, and its dispatches were being picked up and rebroadcast until families across Canada and the United States were following the hunt on their radios night by night. It is sometimes described as the first manhunt the public followed live by radio, and that attention is exactly why the legend grew so fast, because every dispatch reported the same impossible fact. Capture. Search parties found the remains of his camps, and the camps told a story that unsettled experienced northern men. He was not building proper fires. Cold like that, a fire is life, and a fire is also a signal, visible for miles across open snow, and by the evidence he was mostly going without, sheltering in snowdrifts and under riverbanks, at most warming food over tiny, smokeless twig fires tucked under cut banks, eating almost nothing and still covering distances on snowshoes that dog teams struggled to match. Man, breaking trail on snowshoes in deep cold burns somewhere on the order of 5,000 or more calories a day, and the body in extreme cold burns extra simply to hold its core temperature. He was running that furnace on squirrels and whiskey jacks, and he was outpacing teams of fed dog. Survival instructors still cite this stretch as close to the theoretical limit of human cold endurance. More than once, per later accounts from searchers, patrols cut fresh snowshoe tracks that curved around and fell in behind their own trail. Hunters were being men who had trapped that country their whole lives began sleeping badly because the mathematics of it were plain. He knew where they were and they did not know where he was. On January 30th, a 4-man patrol finally cornered him in a creek gully off the Rat, and the patrol was led by Constable Edgar Mullen, the same Edgar Mullen who had interviewed Johnson in Fort McPherson months before, chosen for the forward parties partly because he was the one officer who could recognize the man on sight. Mullen was 30 years old, Belfast-born and experienced and well-liked. Off him were Carl Gardlund, the trapper whose flashlight Johnson had shot away at the siege, a signal sergeant named Frank Riddell, and a trapper named Noel Verville. Way caught Johnson in camp, one of the only times in 7 weeks anyone surprised him, and in the firefight that followed, Mullen was shot through the chest and died in the snow within moments. According to men who were present, recorded in later accounts, the only sound anyone ever heard Albert Johnson make during the entire 7-week manhunt came in that gully. They said he laughed. I want to be careful with that detail, because it comes from memory under fire and it has grown in the retelling, but it is in the record, and it is the reason so much later writing painted him as something other than an ordinary fugitive. Creek where Edgar Mullen died now that the hunt hardened. More volunteers came in, the government authorized extra resources, and the police did something no Canadian manhunt had done before. Called in an airplane, a Belanca monoplane on skis flown north by Wilfred May, known to the whole country as Wap May. And you should know who that was, because the newspaper certainly. 14 years earlier, in April of 1918, May had been a rookie pilot over France, and the German ace chasing him down the Somme Valley, guns jammed or firing, depending on the account, was Manfred von Richthofen, the Red Baron, in the last minutes of his life before he was shot down. Now the man the Red Baron could not catch was hunting a trapper on snowshoes. May's Belanca changed the entire economy of the chase, because it could haul in a month of supplies in hours, move fresh men to the front of the trail, and, above all, see. In the airplane mattered because Johnson now did the thing that, more than any shot he fired, built his legend. He went up and over the Richardson Mountains in February in a blizzard. Richardsons rise well over 1,000 meters above that country, and in winter the wind funnels through the passes hard enough to knock a man down and drive the effective temperature far below -50. Local guides had told the police flatly that the winter passes were impassable, that no man could cross on foot in those conditions, and the police had therefore concentrated their patrols on the 2 known routes and treated the divide itself as a wall. Not using historians studying the case believe he climbed through the storm itself, deliberately, likely because the wind erased his tracks as fast as he made them, and because no pursuer would follow into weather like that, cross the divide, and came down into the Yukon on the far side, all of it, again, without a fire. When his snowshoe prints were found on the Bell River drainage days later, the effect on the search parties by their own later accounts was close to disbelief because it meant the wall had not held and the entire search had to pivot into a second territory. Even in the Yukon he kept working the country like an instrument. He traveled in the trampled trails of migrating caribou herds so his prints disappeared among thousands of hoofprints. Say he at times walked backward in his snowshoes to reverse the apparent direction of his trail. From 2,000 feet, Wap May could read the snow the way no ground tracker could, and on his sweeps along the Eagle River he found the exact points where a lone set of snowshoe tracks slipped out of the caribou trails and away. The airplane had done to Johnson precisely what Johnson had done to the posse for 6 weeks. It got above him, unseen and watched. The morning of February 17, 1932, on a hairpin bend of the frozen Eagle River in the northern Yukon, the two sides finally met by accident. Johnson was moving along the river ice, and for once his trail sense failed him, and the geography explains why. The river there loops back on itself so tightly that sound and sight lines are cut off by the banks, and he had taken to the open ice likely because he was, by then, near the end of his strength. Police patrol came around the bend behind him, and in the confusion of the meander he was briefly walking toward part of the posse rather than away from it. Earl Hersey, an army signalman attached to the hunt and a former competitive runner, was in the lead with his dog team, and Johnson's first shot dropped him on the ice, a single bullet that, per the medical account, struck his elbow, his knee, and his chest, 1 round, 3 wounds because of how Hersey was crouched at his sled. That shot was fired offhand at distance by a starving man who had just spent 7 weeks in the open. Johnson then threw himself behind his pack in the middle of the open river and dug into the snow, taking the only cover that existed while the patrol spread along both banks above him. He was in the bottom of a shooting gallery and he knew it. The patrol called on him to surrender. He answered by reloading. In the exchange that followed, the man who called himself Albert Johnson was struck 9 times and died on the ice 7 weeks in roughly 300 kilometers of Arctic winter after he had fired through his cabin door. Final bullet, per the post-mortem account, severed his spine at the pelvis, and even the men who shot him spoke of the moment with something other than triumph. Wat May, circling overhead, watched the whole thing and later said that from the air Johnson looked like a wolf at bay. May landed the Belanca on the river ice, loaded the gravely wounded Hersey aboard, and flew him the roughly 125 miles to the hospital at Aklavik in well under an hour, a flight credited with saving his life, a distance that had taken the ground parties weeks to cover in the other direction. Hersey recovered fully. And then the men on the river went through the dead man's possessions, and the case stopped being a manhunt and became a mystery that is never closed. Body itself was the first entry. He was emaciated, worn down to sinew, his feet and hands damaged by the weeks outside, and the photograph taken of his face after death, the one with the frozen grimace, became one of the most unsettling images in Canadian police history, and it was published widely for a single practical reason, in the hope that someone, somewhere, would recognize him. No one ever did. Here is the inventory as recorded by $1,410 in Canadian and American bills, at a time when that sum equaled several years of a working man's wages, the rough equivalent of some $50,000 today, carried loose through a siege, a mountain crossing, and 7 weeks of storms. Gold, including pieces of gold dental work, some of it kept loose in a container, and researchers still dispute whose teeth that gold had come from, because it did not all match his own mouth, and every explanation for a man carrying other people's dental gold runs somewhere dark. Compass, a razor, a knife made from a trap spring, which is to say a knife he had made himself, fish hooks and nails, matches, dead squirrel and a dead bird frozen carried his food, and that was his entire larder at the end. Model 99 rifle in 30-30, a fast cycling lever action that explains some of the volume of firemen reported from the cabin, a sawed-off shotgun, and a .22. That is the whole list. No letters, no diary, no photographs, no identification of any kind, not one object with a name on it. A man's pockets are usually a biography in miniature, his were a locked door. Oh, let me lay out the questions this leaves, the ones investigators wrote down in 1932 and the ones researchers are still working on now. One, who was he? The name Albert Johnson led no missing person matching him was ever tied to it, and the police came to believe the name was invented, possibly borrowed, because there were other Johnsons in the region's records, none of them him. The most sustained attempt to answer this belonged to the journalist and historian Dick North, who spent over 40 years on the case and built a detailed argument that Johnson had earlier traveled the Yukon under the name Arthur Nelson, a silent stranger who moved through Ross River and Mayo between 1927 and 1931 buying the same kinds of supplies, and that behind both names stood a Norwegian-born North Dakota bank robber named Johnny Johnson. Hold that thought, because science eventually got to test it. Question 2. Why did he fire through that door at all? The original complaint against him was minor, possibly false, and carried a trivial penalty, a fine at worst, yet his reaction was instant and lethal, which has led many researchers to conclude he was not defending a trapline but a past, that somewhere behind him there was something that made an ordinary police knock feel like the end of the world. Excavated floor supports that reading, because you do not dig a rifle pit under your cabin in the autumn unless you expect, someday, to use it. Remains in. Question 3. Where did the money and the gold come from in the depths of the Great Depression, in a year when a quarter of the workforce was unemployed, carried loose in the pockets of a man living in a shed with no furs and no license, which is to say no visible income at all? Question 4. Why did he never speak? Across 7 weeks through a siege, a killing, and a final standoff on open ice, there is not one recorded word from him. Not a curse, not a surrender refused out loud. Silence, and once, if the accounts are right, that laugh. Question 5. The one northern travelers keep returning to, how did he physically do it? No fire in -40. Out walking dog teams. Winter crossing of the Richardsons through a blizzard. Survival specialists who have studied the route say the performance sits at the outer edge of what a human body can do. He did it while starving. There is one more chapter, and it is recent. August of 2007, a forensic team, working with the permission of the community of Aklavik and with a documentary crew recording the process, exhumed the grave where the man had been buried in 1932. The team included forensic scientists in odontology, anthropology, and genetics, and despite 75 years in the permafrost-adjacent ground, they recovered enough material to extract a usable DNA profile, and for the first time the long list of families who believed the mad trapper was their missing relative, and there were many, because for decades letters had arrived from Scandinavia, the United States, and across Canada, could actually be tested against the man himself. Results, per the team's published finding, most prominent family claims did not match, and neither, when the comparison was finally run, did the descendants connected to Johnny Johnson of North Dakota, the candidate Dick North had spent 4 decades building the case for. 40 years of careful archival work, eliminated by a cheek swab. That is not a failure of the research, it is what the science is for, but it tells you how deep this hole goes. Analysis did add real information, and his isotope studies of his teeth, which lock in a chemical signature of the water and food a person consumed in childhood, indicated he had grown up either in Scandinavia or in the American Midwest, two regions whose signatures overlap. The expensive gold dental work in his own mouth, sophisticated bridge work for the era, suggested money in his background, and, likely, American dentistry, which sits strangely against the man who made his own knife from a trap spring and lived silent in a shed. Man of means, from somewhere specific, who became no one on purpose, and did it so thoroughly that the best forensic science of the 21st century could only narrow the world down to two large regions and a dentist's chair. Brings back the promise from the top of this episode that nearly every word of the name the newspapers gave him was wrong. The mad trapper of Rat River. By the evidence, he was likely not mad because everything he did, the excavated cabin, the fireless travel, the backtracking, the storm crossing, the choice to climb into a blizzard because the blizzard erased him, was methodical to the point of coldness, planning under pressure of a kind that madness does not produce. He was barely a trapper because he held no license and his cabin held no meaningful furs, and he was almost certainly not named Johnson. 3 words, 3 misses. The only true part was the river. If you take one thing from this case, let it be the shape of it rather than the legend. For 7 weeks in the winter of 1932, the full machinery of northern law enforcement, dog teams, dozens of men, dynamite, radio, and an airplane flown by a national hero, hunted one man through the Rat River country and over the Richardson Mountains, and for most of those 7 weeks the man was functionally hunting them back using cold and distance and storm the way other fugitives use crowds. Cost Constable Edgar Malin his life at 30 years old, doing his job in the snow, and his name deserves to be remembered ahead of the fugitives, which is easy to honor in this case because the fugitive never had a name to remember. The man in the Aklavik grave has now been silent for over 90 years, and the 2007 testing means the silence is likely permanent unless some family somewhere produces the one profile that matches. Well then, the file stays where it is. Man came down the Peel River on a raft in July of 1931 carrying cash, gold, and no past, and 8 months later he died on the ice of the Eagle River without ever saying who he was. Every answer in this case was bought at a terrible price except the only one anyone actually wanted. You know someone who thinks they know this story, the version with the madmen and the trapper, send them this episode because the documented case is stranger than the legend. If these northern files are the kind of thing you want more of, subscribe and leave a like so the next case finds you. Is already on the table. I will see you there.